Hi, thanks for tuning in today. Today, I want to consider one of the other millennial views that's out there. This is typically held by those that would hold to a position like hyper-preterism. Now, I've expressed my views on hyper-preterism in another video. Those who hold to that view would consider themselves to be full preterist or consistent preterist. I have some real concerns about that. Like I said, I've expressed that in another video. I do want to express myself in such a way that is not unnecessarily offensive to these people who hold this view. There are people who hold to a position, this position, who watch this YouTube channel, and appreciate them watching. And I hope that we can have a conversation with one another that's respectful and not unnecessarily rude. I don't question the motives or the integrity of people who hold this view. I know some people who I've interacted with on my YouTube channel who have a very high view of Scripture. They hold to the Scriptures very firmly. And the reason why they hold the views that they do is because they believe that's what Scripture teaches. And so it's to the Scriptures that we go. Scripture is our authority. This is where my authority comes from. So I take the Scriptures very seriously, and whatever they teach, that's what we want to hold to. My reservations and concerns on this hyper-preterist view is in regards to what Paul says. Paul says that he talks about Hymenaeus and Philetus, that they shipwrecked the faith of some, stating that the resurrection had passed already, and it hadn't. My concern there with the doctrine of the resurrection is that if a person holds to the view that the resurrection has passed already, and it has not indeed passed already, that they could be making the same kind of mistake that Hymenaeus and Philetus made. Again, I don't question the motive or integrity of the men who hold these. The views that they do, they believe these things based on their interpretation of Scripture. I believe that their interpretation is mistaken. Now, in regards to the millennium, there are some people who would hold that the millennium is a 40-year period. And I want to give a few reasons why I don't think that works. I don't think it's right. It might be the case. It may be the case that the 1,000 years spoken of in Revelation chapter 20 is a symbolic period of time. I've not concluded my studies on the millennium yet. I'm still wrestling with those, still thinking about those. But it seems to me that the arguments that's been made to say that it's possibly a symbolic period of time are good arguments. I think that there's other arguments that could be made to make it a literal period of time. I think a premillennialist, an amillennialist, or a postmillennialist could make a good case for their position. But even if it is a symbolic period of time, I don't think it's very likely that it's symbolic of a short period of time. According to Jesus, he believed that there were going to be things that were going to happen in his generation. He says, "This generation shall not pass away until all these things be fulfilled." He said that in the Olivet Discourse. That turned out to be about a 40-year period. And I think we could draw other scriptures together. It's a pretty common view that a 40 years represents a generation. But whatever view you take on the millennium, if you take the millennium to be if you take the millennium to be a symbolic period of time, I think whatever you do with it, you're sort of committed to the idea that it's a long period of time, not a single generation, but multiple generations. So it's hard for me to see, even if we take, so you might take scriptures like, he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, he's faithful to 1,000 generations, a day in your courts is better than 1,000. 1,000 can be a large, round number. What I can't think of is where it represents like something very short. You might take, a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. Well, that's kind of comparing our scale of time to God's scale of time. I don't think that analogy really works here. 1,000 years, if it represents anything, and if it, let's say it's not a literal period of time, and I'm not committing myself either way on that right now, but let's just say for the sake of argument that it is a symbolic period of time, you would expect it to be symbolic of a long period of time, not a short. Just like if you say he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, well, certainly he owns it on 1,001, 1,002, all the hills, more than 1,000 hills, a lot. But you wouldn't think that it represents just 40 hills. So the first problem with it is, I think if the 1,000 years is symbolic, it would be symbolic of a long period of time, not a short period of time. Secondly, I think we have a problem with how we would consider the devil. So it's obvious in the New Testament. So if you don't recall, in Revelation chapter 20, the devil is bound at the beginning of the 1,000 years and loosed at the end of the 1,000 years. So he's bound for a 1,000-year period. I think the problem with taking the millennial period as starting at Jesus' ministry and ending in the year 70 is that we have from the New Testament itself that the devil is active and very involved through that 40-year period. So even so you might say, well, that's symbolic too. He's just bound in regards to not letting the gospel go out to the nations. He's bound in respect to the gospel spread to the nations. Because I think the book of Revelation says that he's bound that he doesn't go out and deceive the nations anymore. But the problem with that is that the book of Revelation introduces us to characters. By characters, I mean entities. So we're introduced to the false prophet. We're introduced to the beast. We're introduced to the woman, the prostitute, and all of these are introduced in the book of Revelation as causing some sort of problem or mayhem, and then there's some sort of resolution that's brought to their case. The problem is Revelation chapter 12, Revelation chapter 13, all show us that the devil is very active, even during the period between AD 30 and AD 70, even on very many popular preterist interpretations. So I'm getting my Bible out, and I'm looking down now at my physical Bible because I like holding an actual Bible in my hand sometimes. And you can see that in Revelation chapter 12, we're told that the devil goes out. There's war in heaven. Satan's cast out. And he goes about the earth knowing that he has but a short time. Well, he's not bound. So we're talking about internal coherence of the symbols in the book of Revelation. Chapter 12, he's going about persecuting the woman who's brought forth the man-child. The woman who's brought forth the man-child, in my view at least, is a picture of how Jesus was brought to birth, the man-child representing Jesus, and then Satan goes out to persecute the church and the remnant of her seed. But he's not bound in this picture. Rather, he's loosed and free. So we're introduced to the character of the devil, and in the book of Revelation, he's going about, during this interim period, persecuting, causing mayhem. So the picture of what the devil is doing in Revelation chapter 12 is not internally coherent with the idea that he would be bound at the crucifixion of Christ. So further than that, I think we can look at the activity of the two beasts that are introduced to us in Revelation chapter 13. You have a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, and then you have a beast that beast comes out of the sea. You've got another beast that comes up out of the land, and again, there's deception that's involved there. So it's hard to see how the symbols in Revelation could be internally coherent in regards to the devil if the devil himself had already been bound during this period between the ministry of Jesus and AD 70. Even on most popular preterist interpretations. Uh, Thirdly, I would say there's a problem also further than that. I think the biggest problem for me is Revelation 20, to me, very clearly portrays final judgment and the general resurrection. And I don't think we have anything like that in AD 70. For me, resurrection means bodily resurrection. If you want a good definition of what resurrection means, go to 1 Corinthians 15 and look how it's defined. That is, it's likened unto what happened to Christ. Like as Christ was raised up from the dead, just as Christ was raised up from the dead, so we also are going to be raised up from the dead. I'm kind of drawing some of the language from Romans 6 there. I realize that, which is a different topic. But very clearly in 1 Corinthians 15, our resurrection is likened to Christ's resurrection. When Christ died, there was continuity. So when he died, he was buried, he was put in the tomb, and the body that was put into the tomb was transformed into a glorious body. And so it left an empty tomb behind. And so Revelation 20 very clearly, in my judgment, represents the resurrection. And resurrection, for me, means bodily resurrection. So I have three objections to the view that the 40-year period between AD 30 and AD 70 represents the millennium. First, I don't think millennium, 1,000 years, if it is symbolic, would be symbolic of a single generation. Rather, that's a multiple generation thing. That's a symbolic of a long period of time. Secondly, I don't think it meshes well, even making internal sense in the book of Revelation of the activity of Satan. He looks very active up to Revelation chapter 20, and most even preterists would take the period from AD 30 to AD 70 being in some way talked about in these instances where the devil is introduced in Revelation chapter 12 and forward. And so I don't think the symbols internally cohere together very well in the book of Revelation if you take this, if you take Satan as being bound in the bottomless pit by the ministry of Christ and being bound throughout the whole church age. That's not to mention the fact that all of his activity going about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour, Peter says. So I don't think it gels well with what we know about Satan's activity in the early church period from 30 to 70. Finally, I don't think it makes very good sense of the doctrine of the resurrection. I think we have to do violence to that doctrine in order to make all of this work. So that's my take on this subject. I hope you found this video helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.